The morning sun rose over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the capital city of Burkina Faso. In the eastern quarters, merchants were already setting up their stalls, the aroma of fresh bread and strong coffee mixing with the dusty Sahel air. Children in worn school uniforms hurried along red dirt roads, their laughter a brief respite from the tension that had gripped the nation for months. But today was different. Today, the entire country seemed to hold its breath. In homes across Burkina Faso, from the bustling streets of Bobo Dioulasso to the remote villages near the Mali border, families gathered around radios and mobile phones. Mothers paused their morning chores. Fathers delayed their departure to the fields. Young people crowded into internet cafes, their eyes fixed on screens. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Everyone understood the stakes. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader who had captured the imagination of millions across Africa, was about to face his greatest test. Not on a battlefield where courage could be measured in bullets and blood, but in something far more treacherous, a public confrontation with a man who embodied everything Traoré opposed. A man backed by powerful foreign interests who wanted nothing more than to see this revolutionary experiment fail. The anticipation was suffocating, because this wasn't just about two men. It was about the soul of a nation, about whether genuine change was possible, about whether African leadership could break free from the cycles of corruption, violence, and foreign manipulation that had plagued the continent for generations. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, one must first understand the journey that brought Ibrahim Traoré to this moment. He hadn't been born into power or privilege. He came from an ordinary family in Bondoukoui, a small town where most people struggled to make ends meet, where the promises of politicians were as common as they were empty. Traoré grew up watching his parents work themselves to exhaustion, only to see foreign companies extract gold and other resources from beneath their feet while they remained poor. He attended schools with crumbling walls and missing roofs, where dedicated teachers tried to educate children with outdated textbooks and broken equipment. He saw young men his age, bright and ambitious, forced to risk their lives crossing the Sahara Desert to reach Europe because they saw no future at home. These experiences shaped him, forged him into something different from the typical military officer. When he joined the armed forces, it wasn't for personal glory or advancement. It was because he believed, perhaps naively at first, that he could serve his country, that he could protect his people, that he could make a difference. But military service revealed a different reality. He watched as senior officers grew wealthy while soldiers went without proper equipment. He saw commanders make deals with the same terrorist groups they were supposed to fight. He witnessed politicians sign contracts that sold Burkina Faso's sovereignty piece by piece to foreign powers who cared nothing for the Burkinabe people. The breaking point came in 2022. Burkina Faso was drowning in violence. Terrorist groups, many created or funded by external forces seeking to destabilize the Sahel region, were massacring civilians, displacing communities, and creating a humanitarian catastrophe. The government, led by Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, seemed paralyzed, more concerned with maintaining power than protecting people. Traoré made a choice. Along with other young officers who shared his vision, he led a movement to remove Damiba from power. It wasn't a decision made lightly. He knew the risks. He knew he would be called a coup leader, a dictator, a threat to democracy. But he also knew that sometimes, when all legitimate channels for change are blocked, when your people are dying and your country is being sold to the highest bidder, you have to act. The international community predictably condemned the transition. Western nations issued stern statements about democracy and constitutional order, conveniently forgetting their own history of supporting dictators across Africa when it suited their interests. France, which had maintained a neo-colonial grip on Burkina Faso for decades, was particularly vocal in its criticism. But something unexpected happened. The Burkinabe people rallied behind Traoré, not because they loved military rule, but because they recognized something genuine in this young captain. He didn't move into a presidential palace. He didn't enrich himself. He didn't surround himself with cronies. Instead, he got to work. He began expelling foreign military bases, particularly French forces that had been in the country for years, ostensibly fighting terrorism. But somehow the terrorism only seemed to get worse while French access to Burkina Faso's resources remained secure. He initiated agricultural programs to help farmers. He started building and renovating schools. He reformed the military, removing corrupt officers and improving conditions for ordinary soldiers. Most significantly, he spoke to people with respect. He didn't talk down to them or make empty promises. He acknowledged the challenges, admitted he didn't have all the answers, but committed to working alongside the people to find solutions. He invoked the memory of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader from the 1980s, who had similarly challenged foreign exploitation before being assassinated in a coup backed by foreign interests. This approach earned Traoré millions of supporters, particularly among young Africans across the continent who were tired of leadership that served foreign masters rather than their own people. But it also earned him powerful enemies. Foreign corporations that had enjoyed unrestricted access to Burkina Faso's resources suddenly found themselves facing a government that demanded fair terms. International financial institutions that had kept the country in debt dependency discovered a leader unwilling to accept their conditions. Regional powers who benefited from Burkina Faso's instability grew alarmed at the prospect of a stable, sovereign nation that might inspire others to follow the same path. These forces needed to undermine Traoré. Military intervention was too obvious, too costly, too likely to backfire and create a martyr. Economic sanctions would hurt ordinary Burkinabé more than their leader and would further strengthen his narrative about foreign exploitation. Diplomatic isolation had already been tried and only made him more popular at home. So they chose a different strategy: internal destabilization. They would support rebel groups, fund opposition movements, and create chaos that would make Traoré look incompetent, unable to provide security or governance. They would force him into an endless cycle of conflict that would drain resources, divide the population, and eventually lead to his downfall. This is where Mamadou Kaboré enters our story. Mamadou Kaboré was not born evil. This is important to understand because the story of his confrontation with Traoré is not a simple tale of good versus evil, but something more complex, more human, more tragic. Kaboré had once been a promising military officer. He came from a respected family in the north, attended military academy, and showed real talent for leadership and strategy. His early career was marked by commendations and steady advancement. He was seen as someone who might one day lead the armed forces, who might serve his country with distinction. But somewhere along the way, Kaboré lost his path. Perhaps it was the frustration of watching less competent officers get promoted because of political connections. Perhaps it was the bitterness of seeing his soldiers die needlessly because of inadequate equipment and corrupt supply chains. Perhaps it was simply the temptation of money in a country where most people struggled with poverty. Whatever the reason, Kaboré began making compromises. Small ones at first, looking the other way when certain shipments went missing, accepting gifts from contractors, using his position for minor personal advantages. But compromises have a way of compounding. Each small betrayal makes the next one easier, until you wake up one day and realize you've become someone you once would have despised. By the time Traoré came to power, Kaboré had already crossed too many lines to go back. He had taken money from foreign intelligence services. He had established relationships with criminal networks. He had made enemies within the new government who knew his history and wouldn't allow him to continue his corrupt practices. So when foreign interests came looking for someone to destabilize Traoré's government, Kaboré was a perfect candidate. He had military training, connections in the north, and no loyalty to the new regime. More importantly, he had debts, both financial and moral, that made him vulnerable to pressure. The offer was substantial: money, weapons, protection, and the promise of power in whatever government replaced Traoré. All he had to do was create chaos, make Traoré look weak, and keep Burkina Faso unstable enough that foreign interests could continue their exploitation. Kaboré accepted. He formed a militia, recruited disaffected soldiers and unemployed young men with promises of money and power. He established bases in remote areas where government forces couldn't easily reach him. He began a campaign of terror, attacking villages, disrupting supply lines, assassinating local officials loyal to Traoré. But Traoré wasn't stupid. He understood that brute force alone wouldn't be enough to bring down Traoré. The young captain had too much popular support, too much moral authority. What Traoré needed was to damage that authority, to make Traoré look weak or hypocritical or no different from all the corrupt leaders who came before him. When international mediators, themselves often serving foreign interests, arranged a negotiation meeting, Traoré saw his opportunity. This wouldn't be a genuine peace negotiation. It would be a stage, a carefully orchestrated performance where he would humiliate Traoré in front of the world, break his mystique, show him to be just another military strongman who couldn't control his own country. Traoré spent days preparing. He studied Traoré's speeches, looking for weaknesses and contradictions he could exploit. He consulted with his foreign backers about the best approach. He practiced his lines, rehearsed his confrontational stance, even selected his outfit carefully. Expensive designer sunglasses, imported boots, clothing that announced wealth and power. He was confident. Perhaps overconfident. Because what Traoré didn't understand, what none of Traoré's enemies seemed to understand, was that the young captain's power didn't come from military might or political maneuvering. It came from something deeper, something that couldn't be attacked with insults or intimidation. It came from authenticity, from genuine commitment to his principles, from a moral clarity that was unshakable because it wasn't based on self-interest. This fundamental misunderstanding would be Traoré's downfall. The military compound in Ouagadougou had been chosen carefully for this meeting. It was secure enough to prevent any unfortunate incidents, but open enough that cameras could capture everything. The compound usually housed regular military training exercises, but today it had been transformed into a negotiation venue. Long wooden tables were arranged in a square formation. Chairs were positioned with precise spacing, name placards carefully placed. International mediators, representing various organizations whose neutrality was more performative than real, bustled about making final preparations. Government officials from Traoré's administration arrived and took their positions, their faces showing the strain of months of conflict. Foreign observers, journalists from international media outlets, and representatives from regional organizations filled the observation areas. Cameras were everywhere. Professional video equipment, journalists' cameras, smartphones recording from multiple angles. Everyone knew this meeting would be watched by millions. Everyone understood that what happened here would resonate far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and underlying dread. These kinds of meetings rarely went well. Too many competing interests, too many hidden agendas, too much pride and posturing. Most people expected either a violent incident or a meaningless agreement that would be violated within days. Ibrahim Traoré arrived early, as was his habit. He traveled with a small security detail, nothing ostentatious or excessive. He wore his simple military fatigues, the same uniform worn by ordinary soldiers. No special insignia beyond his captain's rank. No decorations or medals, even though he certainly qualified for them. He had always rejected such displays, believing they created artificial distance between leaders and the people they served. As Traoré entered the compound, something interesting happened. The soldier standing guard, who maintained professional neutrality during these proceedings, couldn't help but straighten up a little more when he passed. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because Traoré had done something rare among military leaders. He had improved their lives. Under his leadership, soldiers received better pay, better equipment, better training. More importantly, they received respect. Traoré ate the same food as his soldiers, slept in similar conditions when visiting bases, and never asked them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. This created loyalty that couldn't be bought or forced, loyalty born from genuine reciprocal respect. Traoré greeted the mediators politely but without excessive deference. He shook hands with government officials, asked about their families, showed the personal touch that made him beloved by his team. Then he took his seat at the table, reviewing papers, occasionally looking up to observe the room, but mostly maintaining a calm, centered presence. Those who watched him closely noticed something. He wasn't nervous. There was no fidgeting, no repeated checking of phone or watch, no whispered consultations with advisors. He sat with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. It was the confidence not of arrogance, but of clarity. An hour passed. The mediators grew restless. Officials checked their watches repeatedly. The scheduled start time came and went. This delay was deliberate, Kabore's first power move. Keep them waiting. Make them feel his importance. Build anticipation and anxiety. Finally, sounds from outside. Vehicles approaching, many vehicles, engines revving unnecessarily loud. Then Mamadou Kabore made his entrance, and it was designed to intimidate. Kabore arrived with approximately 40 armed men. They wore mismatched military gear, some pieces clearly stolen from government forces, others supplied by his foreign backers. They carried their weapons openly, fingers near triggers. A deliberate violation of the agreement that this would be a peaceful negotiation with minimal security. The mediators immediately objected, but Kabore ignored them. His men fanned out around the compound, positioning themselves strategically, creating an atmosphere of menace. It was psychological warfare, designed to make everyone feel threatened, to establish Kabore as the one with real power here. Kabore himself was dressed like a man trying to announce his success and importance. Designer sunglasses that probably cost more than a rural family's annual income. Expensive imported boots. A mix of military and civilian clothing that suggested he was above such simple categories as soldier or civilian. He was something more, something special. He walked with exaggerated swagger, chin up, chest out, playing to the cameras he knew were recording everything. His men followed, trying to match his energy, creating a small parade of aggressive masculinity. The contrast with Traoré's modest entrance couldn't have been more stark. And that contrast was exactly what millions watching would remember. One man needed 40 armed guards and expensive clothes to feel important. The other needed only his principles and his people's trust. As Kabore approached the central table where negotiations would take place, he made a show of surveying the room, nodding to his men, ignoring the mediator's requests that he reduce his security presence. He was establishing dominance, or at least trying to. Then his eyes fixed on Ibrahim Traoré, who sat calmly at the table, watching this performance with the detached interest of someone observing a phenomenon, not participating in it. Kabore smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who believes he's cornered his prey. What Kabore didn't realize, what he couldn't realize because of his own fundamental misunderstanding of power, was that the truly dangerous person in that room wasn't the one with 40 armed men. It was the one who needed none. The mediators called for everyone to take their seats. Government officials settled nervously into their chairs. Foreign observers leaned forward in anticipation. Journalists adjusted their cameras to ensure they captured every moment. But Kabore didn't sit. Standing while others sat was another power play, another way to literally look down on his opponent. He positioned himself directly across from Traoré, hands placed deliberately on the table, leaning forward in a posture designed to invade personal space and dominate. The room fell silent. Even the soldiers around the perimeter seemed to hold their breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment that would define not just this meeting, but possibly the entire trajectory of Burkina Faso's future. Kabore began to speak. His voice loud, projected not just to fill the room, but to be captured clearly by every camera, every recording device. He wanted the world to hear this, and what happened next would indeed shock the world, but not in the way Kabore expected. "So this is the great Ibrahim Traoré," Kabore announced, his voice dripping with theatrical contempt. "The boy captain who thinks he can save Burkina Faso, the one who kicked out the French and thought he could do better." The insult was carefully crafted. Calling him boy was meant to diminish him, to make him seem young and inexperienced. Thinks he can save implied naivety and delusion. The reference to expelling French forces was meant to paint Traoré as reckless and anti-Western. Kabore paused, letting his words settle, watching for Traoré's reaction. A normal politician might have bristled at being called a boy. A typical military leader might have responded to the challenge in his tone, but Traoré did neither. He simply continued to sit calmly, his hands folded on the table, his expression neutral but attentive. This lack of reaction seemed to frustrate Kaboré, so he escalated, leaning even closer, his face now just inches from Traoré's. "You think you're a revolutionary? You think you're Sankara reborn?" Kaboré continued, invoking the name of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's legendary leader who had been assassinated in 1987. It was a deliberately provocative comparison, meant to mock Traoré's revolutionary rhetoric. "Let me tell you something. Boy," Kaboré pressed on, his voice growing more aggressive, "you're in over your head. You don't have the money, you don't have the weapons, and you don't have the respect. You're just a child playing soldier." Government officials in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down at the table, unable to watch this public humiliation. Mediators exchanged worried glances, wondering if they should intervene, but uncertain how. Foreign observers scribbled notes furiously, already composing the stories they would file about this confrontation. Kaboré was building to his climax, the knockout punch he believed would destroy Traoré's credibility forever. And soon, very soon, "You'll be replaced just like all the others before you." It was a death threat wrapped in a prediction. The implication was clear. Traoré's days were numbered, just like Sankara's had been. Just like every African leader who tried to challenge the established order. Kaboré straightened up slightly, placing his hands flat on the table in a posture of dominance, and waited for Traoré's response. He expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps a threat in return. What he wanted was to provoke Traoré into losing his composure, into responding in a way that would make him look weak or tyrannical, or no different from other authoritarian leaders. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. The room held its collective breath. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré's face, capturing every micro-expression, looking for signs of rage or fear or weakness. But Ibrahim Traoré remained absolutely still. His hands stayed folded on the table. His breathing remained slow and steady. His eyes, however, never left Kaboré's face, and there was something in that gaze, something unshakable and profound, that began to unsettle the rebel commander. It wasn't a hostile glare or an angry stare. It was something more powerful. It was the gaze of someone looking at you with complete clarity, seeing not just your words but your motivations, your fears, your essential nature. It was the look of someone who couldn't be intimidated because they had already accepted all possible consequences and chosen their path anyway. Kaboré's smirk, which had been so confident moments before, began to falter. He glanced at his men, perhaps looking for reassurance. But they were watching Traoré now, and something in the young captain's presence had captured their attention in a way Kaboré's theatrics never had. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Traoré spoke. His voice was quiet, measured, with none of the aggressive volume Kaboré had used. Yet somehow it carried more authority, more weight, more power than all of Kaboré's shouting. "Are you finished?" 3 words. Just 3 simple words. But the impact was devastating. The question wasn't asked with anger or sarcasm. It was asked with the kind of patient tolerance you might use with a child throwing a tantrum. It acknowledged Kaboré's performance while simultaneously dismissing its significance. It took all the air out of the rebel commander's theatrical display and revealed it for what it was: empty noise. The room, already silent, somehow became even more still. Several of Kaboré's own men visibly reacted, their expressions shifting from aggressive support of their leader to something more thoughtful, more questioning. Kaboré tried to recover, forcing a laugh and turning to his men as if this was all a joke, as if he had intended this response all along. But his men weren't laughing. They were still watching Traoré, waiting to see what would happen next. And then Ibrahim Traoré stood up. He didn't stand quickly or aggressively. He rose slowly, with the deliberate dignity of someone who was about to say something important and wanted everyone to be able to hear it clearly. He still didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his presence commanded attention more effectively than any shouting could. Traoré's eyes never left Kaboré's face as he spoke, but his words were for everyone in the room, everyone watching across the country and beyond. "You came here today to humiliate me," Traoré said, his voice carrying that same quiet intensity. "You came here because your foreign masters told you to, because they are afraid of what Burkina Faso represents, afraid of what happens when African people stand up and say, 'No more.'" The accusation was direct and devastating. By naming Kaboré's foreign backing, Traoré had reframed the entire confrontation. This wasn't just two men disagreeing. It was about national sovereignty versus foreign interference. It was about dignity versus sellout. Kaboré tried to interrupt, his mouth opening to object. But Traoré raised a single hand in a gesture that somehow commanded respect. And the rebel commander found himself falling silent despite his 40 armed men around the compound. "You call me a boy. You call me a child," Traoré continued, his voice steady and unwavering. "Maybe I am young, but I would rather be a young man fighting for his people than an old traitor selling his soul for dollars and euros." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Around the room, reactions rippled through the crowd. Several soldiers nodded almost unconsciously. Government officials sat up straighter, inspired by this defense not of personal honor but of principle. Even some of the international observers, trained to maintain journalistic objectivity, found themselves moved by the stark moral clarity of Traoré's response. Kaboré's face darkened with rage, but he seemed paralyzed, unable to find a response that wouldn't make things worse. He had expected a fight, wanted a fight, but Traoré wasn't fighting on the terms Kaboré understood. Traoré pressed on, his voice growing stronger but never louder, gaining power from conviction rather than volume. "You think I don't have money? I don't need money. My people are my wealth, the farmers who feed us, the teachers who educate our children, the workers who build our future. That is wealth that cannot be stolen or bought." He paused, letting this sink in, then continued. "You think I don't have weapons? My greatest weapon is the truth, and the truth is that every Burkinabe knows who serves them and who betrays them." Another pause. The room was absolutely transfixed now. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It felt like something deeper, something that transcended the immediate confrontation and touched on fundamental questions about power, loyalty, and human dignity. "And you think I don't have respect?" Traoré's gaze swept across the entire room, taking in not just Kaboré, but every person present. "Look around you, Mamadou. Who do these people respect? A man who fights for them or a man who sells them out?" The question was rhetorical, but the answer was written on every face in the room. Even among Kaboré's own men, there were signs of discomfort, doubt creeping into their expressions. They had signed up to fight for a strong leader, but increasingly it was looking like they had chosen the wrong side. Traoré took a step closer to Kaboré, closing the distance between them with the confidence of someone who had nothing to fear because he had nothing to hide. "I know what you're trying to do here today," Traoré said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, though still perfectly audible throughout the room. "You want to make me lose my temper. You want me to respond with violence or threats. You want to make me look like just another authoritarian leader, no different from all the others." He shook his head slowly, almost sadly. "But I won't give you that satisfaction, because I know something you don't seem to understand. True strength isn't about dominating others. It's about staying true to yourself, to your principles, even when it's difficult." The confrontation had completely shifted. Kaboré, who had arrived with such confidence and swagger, now looked diminished. His expensive sunglasses and designer boots seemed ridiculous rather than impressive. His 40 armed men looked more like a sign of weakness than strength, because everyone could see that Traoré needed none of that to command respect. What happened next would shock everyone even more. Kaboré, sensing he was losing control of the situation, reached for his final weapon, intimidation through violence. His hand moved deliberately to the pistol at his belt. He didn't draw it. That would have been too overtly aggressive and might have provoked Traoré's security team into action. Instead, he simply rested his hand on it, a gesture that was simultaneously subtle and unmistakable. Brave words from a man surrounded by his loyal soldiers, Traoré said, his voice taking on a cold, menacing edge. But what happens when you're not surrounded, Traoré? What happens when your protection is gone? How brave will you be then? The threat was clear. This wasn't just about today's meeting. Traoré was implying that Traoré would be assassinated, just like Sankara had been, just like so many African leaders who challenged foreign interests had been eliminated. The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly. Several of Traoré's security team tensed, their hands moving toward their own weapons. Mediators stood up, calling for calm, their voices high with panic. Foreign observers backed away from the central confrontation, looking for exits. What had been a war of words was about to escalate into actual violence. But then Traoré did something unexpected. He raised his hand again, but this time the gesture was directed at his own security team, signaling them to stand down, to not escalate. Then, to everyone's shock, he took a step closer to Traoré, moving toward the threat rather than away from it. The cameras captured the moment perfectly. Traoré stepping forward, closing the distance until he and Traoré were face to face, so close they could feel each other's breath. Traoré's hand remained on his pistol, trembling slightly now, whether from adrenaline or uncertainty. No one could tell. Traoré's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But in the sudden silence of the room, everyone heard him clearly. "I am not afraid of death." Mamadou. The simple declaration carried enormous weight. This wasn't bravado or performance. It was a statement of fact, delivered with such calm certainty that no one doubted its truth. "I have already accepted that I may die for what I believe in," Traoré continued, his eyes locked on Traoré's. "That's the difference between you and me. You serve yourself. I serve something greater than myself. And that makes me free." He paused, then delivered the devastating final line. "While you are a slave to your fear, your greed, your masters." Traoré's entire body tensed. His hand on the pistol was shaking visibly now. His eyes darted around the room, looking for support, for validation, for any sign that he still had the upper hand. But what he saw in the faces around him wasn't support. It was disappointment, contempt, even pity. His own men were looking at him differently now. Some with confusion, wondering why their supposedly strong leader seemed so rattled by one unarmed man's words. Others with dawning understanding, beginning to question whether they had chosen the right side in this conflict. Traoré's voice grew stronger, filling the room with an authority that needed no weapons, no threats, no performance. "You came here to humiliate me. You came here to make me look weak. But the truth is, you have humiliated only yourself, because everyone here now sees you for what you truly are." He let that hang for a moment, then finished with devastating clarity. "A traitor, a puppet, a man without honor." The words echoed through the room like thunder. Traoré stood frozen, his face cycling through rage, shame, confusion, and something that might have been the first crack in years of denial and self-justification. The tension in the room was unbearable. Traoré's hand remained on his pistol. His men looked uncertain, divided between their loyalty to their commander and their growing respect for the man standing before them with such fearless dignity. Everyone expected violence. Everyone braced for the moment when guns would be drawn, when this confrontation would end in bloodshed and chaos, just like so many conflicts in the region had ended before. But what Ibrahim Traoré did next would change everything. In that moment of maximum tension, when violence seemed inevitable, when every muscle in the room was tensed for the explosion that was about to come, Ibrahim Traoré made a choice that no one expected, that defied all conventional wisdom about power and conflict resolution. He extended his hand. Not aggressively, not as a challenge, but simply offering it across the space between them. His expression had softened, the steel intensity replaced by something else. Compassion, recognition of shared humanity, an offer of a different path. "I forgive you," Traoré said simply. The room erupted in shock. Gasps echoed through the compound. Mediators froze mid-gesture, unable to process what they were witnessing. Government officials looked at each other in disbelief, their faces showing confusion, concern, and something that might have been hope. Even Traoré's own security team seemed stunned by this act of mercy. They had been prepared for violence, ready to defend their leader, but this was something else entirely. Caboret stared at the extended hand as if it were a weapon more dangerous than any gun. His own hand slipped away from his pistol, hanging limply at his side. His face cycled through a dozen emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, suspicion, rage, and finally something that looked like shame or perhaps the first glimmer of self-awareness he'd experienced in years. "You—" "What?" Caboret stammered, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "I forgive you," Traoré repeated, his hand still extended, steady and unwavering. "Not because you deserve it. Not because what you've done is acceptable, but because I choose to break the cycle." He took another step closer, his voice carrying a weight that transcended the immediate moment, reaching for something deeper, something fundamental about human nature and the possibility of change. "You want me to respond with violence, with revenge? That's what they want. That's what keeps this country trapped in endless conflict. Someone attacks, someone retaliates, someone seeks revenge, and on until no one even remembers why we started fighting in the first place." Around the room, people leaned forward, completely absorbed in what Traoré was saying. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso's conflict. It was about the cycles of violence that plagued so many African nations. "So many conflicts around the world. You were once a soldier of Burkina Faso." "Mamadou," Traoré continued, his voice softer now, more personal. "You wore the uniform with pride. You took an oath to protect our people. I remember reading about you in the military reports. You had a distinguished service record. You were someone who could have served this country with honor." This acknowledgement of Caboret's past, this recognition that he hadn't always been a traitor, seemed to affect the rebel commander deeply. His rigid posture began to soften. His expression, which had been locked in aggressive defiance, started to crack. "Somewhere along the way, you lost yourself," Traoré said, and there was genuine sadness in his voice. "Maybe it was frustration with the corruption you saw. Maybe it was bitterness at being passed over for promotion. Maybe it was just the attraction of easy money in a country where most people struggle. I don't know exactly what happened. But I know this. It's not too late. It's never too late to come home." The words hung in the air like an invitation, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Caboret's eyes glistened with moisture. His jaw clenched as he fought some internal battle, decades of choices and compromises warring against a memory of who he used to be, who he might have been, who perhaps he could still become. The silence stretched on, pregnant with possibility. This was a hinge moment, not just for these two men, but for the entire nation watching. Would cycles of violence continue? Would revenge beget revenge? Or could something different emerge? Finally, slowly, Caboret's hand began to rise. It was a tentative movement, as if he wasn't sure himself what he was doing. His fingers trembled as they reached toward Traoré's still extended hand. The journey of those few inches seemed to take forever, each moment heavy with the weight of decision, of choosing between the man he had become and the man he once was. Then contact. Caboret's hand clasped Traoré's, and the handshake that followed lasted only a few seconds. But in those seconds, something profound occurred. The atmosphere in the entire compound transformed. The suffocating tension that had gripped everyone suddenly lifted, like storm clouds parting to reveal clear sky. Someone in the back of the room began to clap. Then another person joined. Within moments, applause swept through the compound like a wave. Government officials, mediators, even some of Caboret's own men were clapping. Not for victory, not for dominance, but for something rare and precious. The possibility of redemption, the hope that cycles of violence could be broken, that enemies could become, if not friends, then at least no longer enemies. Traoré didn't release Caboret's hand immediately. He held it firmly, looking into the rebel commander's eyes with an expression that was neither triumphant nor condescending. It was the look of one human being truly seeing another, acknowledging their pain, acknowledging their mistakes, but also acknowledging their fundamental humanity and their capacity for change. "You can continue down this path," Traoré said quietly, so only Caboret could hear above the applause. You can keep serving foreign interests, keep terrorizing our people, keep running from yourself. Or you can stand with us, help us rebuild, help us heal. The choice is yours, Mamadou. It has always been yours. When Traoré finally released Kabore's hand, the rebel commander stood there, completely transformed. The arrogance was gone. The swagger was gone. The aggressive posturing had evaporated. What remained was a man stripped of his defenses, forced to confront his own reflection in the mirror that Traoré had held up to him. Kabore's lips moved as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. His eyes were still glistening, and one tear finally escaped, rolling down his weathered cheek. He looked around the room, seeing his men watching him, seeing the government officials, the mediators, the cameras capturing everything, and for the first time in years, he seemed to see himself clearly. Without a word, unable to speak through the emotion that was overwhelming him, Kaboré turned and walked out of the room. His posture was completely different from when he had entered. There was no swagger now, no aggressive display. He walked slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, a man carrying the weight of years of choices he could never undo but might somehow begin to atone for. His men followed, but their demeanor had changed as well. They weren't marching in intimidation. They were walking in silence, in contemplation. Several of them glanced back at Traoré as they left, their expressions thoughtful, questioning. They had come expecting to witness their commander dominate this young upstart captain. Instead, they had witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about power and strength. The mediators rushed to congratulate Traoré on his handling of the situation, calling it masterful diplomacy, praising his wisdom and restraint. Government officials surrounded him, offering their admiration and support. Foreign observers approached with questions, wanting quotes for their articles about this extraordinary confrontation. But Ibrahim Traoré seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. He accepted the congratulations politely but briefly, thanking people, but not lingering in the praise. He had no interest in being celebrated for simply doing what he believed any decent person should do, seeing the humanity in an enemy and offering a path to redemption. Within an hour, he had left the compound, returning to his modest residence to continue his work. Because for Traoré, this confrontation wasn't the main event. It was simply one moment among thousands of moments that made up the daily work of trying to serve his country. Reviewing agricultural programs, meeting with educators, planning infrastructure projects, supporting local businesses. But while Traoré might have moved on quickly, the rest of Burkina Faso and much of Africa had not. The video of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was being shared across every social media platform, viewed millions of times. News outlets around the world scrambled to cover the story. In homes across Burkina Faso, families gathered to watch and re-watch the footage. Mothers showed it to their children, using it as a teaching moment about character and forgiveness. Fathers discussed it in the fields and workshops, debating what it meant for their country's future. Young people posted clips with commentary, analyzing every gesture, every word, every nuance of the exchange. The reactions were overwhelmingly positive, but they were also deeply emotional. People weren't just impressed. They were moved. Many reported crying while watching it. Why? Because it represented something they had been hungry for but rarely saw. Leadership that valued human dignity over dominance. Transformation over destruction, hope over revenge. Across Africa, the impact was equally profound. In countries where people had grown cynical about their own leaders, where corruption and violence seemed endemic, where foreign interference remained a constant reality, Ibrahim Traoré's response to Kaboré offered a different vision of what African leadership could be. Young people in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and dozens of other nations shared the video with captions like, "This is the Africa we want," and "This is what real leadership looks like." Political commentators across the continent wrote articles analyzing the confrontation, comparing it to other moments in African history, discussing what it might mean for the future. But perhaps the most significant reaction came not from those who supported Traoré, but from those who had opposed him. International media outlets that had been critical of his military takeover found themselves struggling to reconcile their previous narratives with what they had just witnessed. How do you call someone a dictator when they extend mercy to their enemies? How do you portray someone as a threat to peace when they choose reconciliation over violence? Western governments that had condemned Traoré's coup found their diplomatic messaging complicated by this very public display of moral authority. Their official statements about democracy and constitutional order suddenly rang hollow when contrasted with Traoré's actual behavior, which embodied democratic values of human dignity and reconciliation more genuinely than many elected leaders. They supported foreign corporations and intelligence services that had backed Kaboré's rebellion, found their strategy backfiring spectacularly. They had hoped to make Traoré look weak and incompetent. Instead, they had given him a platform to demonstrate exactly why he commanded such loyalty from his people. Every attempt to undermine him only seemed to strengthen his position, but the most dramatic reaction came 3 days after the confrontation, when Mamadou Kaboré issued a public statement that shocked everyone. The statement came in the form of a video, recorded in a simple setting without any of the armed guards or displays of power that had characterized Kaboré's previous appearances. He sat alone, wearing ordinary clothes, his face showing the strain of 3 days of intense internal struggle. "My name is Mamadou Kaboré," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "3 days ago, I went to a meeting intending to humiliate Captain Ibrahim Traoré. I went there full of arrogance and anger, believing I was strong because I had guns and foreign backing. I was wrong about everything." He paused, gathering himself, visibly fighting to continue. "Captain Traoré did something that no one has done for me in years. He saw me not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a man who had lost his way. He offered me forgiveness when I deserved only condemnation. He reminded me of who I used to be, and in doing so, he forced me to confront who I have become." The camera remained steady on his face as he spoke, capturing every flicker of emotion, every sign of genuine remorse. "I am ashamed," Kaboré continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Ashamed of the things I have done. Ashamed of the people I have hurt. Ashamed that I sold my loyalty and my honor for money and false promises. I cannot undo the past. I cannot bring back those who died because of my actions. But I can stop. And that is what I am doing today." He took a deep breath before making his announcement. "Effective immediately, I am laying down my weapons. I am disbanding my militia. I am asking my men to return to their homes, to their families, to seek honest work and peaceful lives. And I am asking the people of Burkina Faso for something I don't deserve: forgiveness." The statement continued for several more minutes, with Kaboré providing specific details about his operations, acknowledging his foreign backers without naming them directly, likely for his own protection, and expressing his willingness to face justice for his actions. "I don't expect to be trusted," he concluded. "I don't expect to be welcomed back as if nothing happened. But Captain Traoré showed me that it's never too late to change, to choose a different path. So that is what I am doing. I am choosing to stop being part of the problem and to start, in whatever small way I can, being part of the solution." The video ended simply, without dramatic music or editing, just a man making a confession and a commitment. The reaction to Kaboré's statement was mixed and complicated, as such things always are. Some people celebrated it as proof of Traoré's wisdom and the power of mercy. Others remained deeply skeptical, pointing to Kaboré's long history of betrayal and suggesting this was just another manipulation. Security analysts debated whether his confession was genuine or strategic, whether he had been authorized by his foreign backers to make this statement as part of some larger plan, or whether he had truly broken free from their control. Many victims of Kaboré's actions, people who had lost family members to his malicious attacks, villages that had been terrorized by his men, found it difficult or impossible to forgive him. Their pain was real and valid, and Traoré himself acknowledged this in subsequent statements, noting that mercy doesn't erase consequences, and that Kaboré would need to face justice for his crimes even as he was offered the opportunity for redemption. But regardless of the debates and skepticism, the immediate practical effect was undeniable. Kaboré's militia disbanded. Hundreds of armed men who had been fighting against the government laid down their weapons and returned to civilian life. Violence in the northern region decreased significantly. Villages that had lived in fear began to breathe easier. Some of Kaboré's former fighters later gave interviews explaining their decisions. Most echoed similar themes. They had joined the militia for money or because they felt they had no other options, but they had always felt uncomfortable with what they were doing. Seeing their commander humbled by Traoré's mercy, watching him accept responsibility and choose a different path, gave them permission to make the same choice. One former fighter, a young man named Salif, explained it this way: "We thought Kaboré was strong because he didn't show emotion, because he was willing to do anything for money. But Captain Traoré showed us real strength. Real strength is admitting when you're wrong. Real strength is choosing the harder right path over the easier wrong one." When Kaboré reached out and took Traoré's hand, when he accepted that forgiveness, I realized I wanted to be like Traoré, not like the man Kaboré had been. In the weeks and months following the confrontation and Kaboré's surrender, something remarkable began happening across Burkina Faso. Other rebel commanders, inspired by Kaboré's example and moved by Traoré's demonstration of mercy, began reaching out to the government. Not all of them surrendered completely. Not all of them disbanded their groups. But many agreed to negotiations where previously they had refused. Channels of communication opened. Dialogue replaced the automatic assumption of violence. It wasn't a perfect process. There were setbacks and disappointments. Some rebel groups used negotiations as cover to regroup and rearm. Some commanders proved to be beyond redemption, too committed to violence or too entangled with their foreign backers to change course. But overall, the trend was undeniable. Burkina Faso was becoming more peaceful, more stable, more hopeful. The cycle of revenge and retaliation that had plagued the country for years began, slowly and imperfectly, to break. Villages that had been torn apart by conflict started talking about reconciliation. In community meetings facilitated by local elders and government officials, former enemies sat down together. The conversations were difficult, often painful, sometimes breaking down entirely. But they were happening, which was itself a form of progress. Mamadou Kaboré, true to his word, did not seek power or position in the new order. He returned to his home village and began working with local youth. He established informal programs warning them about the dangers of being manipulated by foreign interests, teaching them about the difference between true patriotism and the false promises of easy money through violence. I lost years of my life serving people who cared nothing about me or my country, he would tell groups of young men who came to hear him speak. They used me, and I let myself be used because I thought I was benefiting. But at the end, I had money in my pocket and emptiness in my soul. Don't make my mistakes. If you want to serve Burkina Faso, serve it honestly. Some people in his village never forgave him. They would cross the street to avoid walking past him. They would refuse to acknowledge his greetings. This was painful for Kaboré, but he accepted it as part of the consequences of his actions. He didn't demand forgiveness or expect redemption. He simply tried day by day to do what small good he could. Others gradually softened toward him. They saw genuine change in his behavior. They noticed how he lived simply, how he worked without seeking attention or praise, how he genuinely seemed committed to warning others away from the path he had taken. Slowly, tentatively, some of these people began to accept that perhaps redemption was possible. Perhaps people could change. The story of Traoré and Kaboré became a regular reference point in Burkina Faso's national conversation. Teachers used it in schools to discuss conflict resolution, forgiveness, and leadership. Religious leaders referenced it in their teachings about mercy and redemption. Parents told it to their children as a lesson about choosing who you want to be. But the impact spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across Africa, particularly among young people, Ibrahim Traoré became a symbol of a different kind of leadership. Social media was flooded with discussions about what his approach meant, what it suggested about African governance, what possibilities it opened for the future. In universities from Cairo to Cape Town, students debated the confrontation in political science classes. Was mercy an effective strategy in conflict resolution? Could Traoré's approach be replicated in other contexts? What did it say about traditional versus contemporary models of leadership? Young activists in countries still suffering under corrupt or authoritarian regimes pointed to Traoré as evidence that another way was possible. Look at what's happening in Burkina Faso, they would say in protests and online forums. Look at how a leader can serve the people rather than exploit them. We don't have to accept the corruption and violence. We can demand better. Not everyone agreed with or supported Traoré. Some critics argued that his mercy toward Kaboré was naive, that it would encourage other rebels to think they could commit atrocities without facing real consequences. Others suggested that the whole confrontation had been staged, a performance designed to enhance Traoré's image. Conservative voices in some countries, particularly those whose governments felt threatened by Traoré's example, dismissed him as an anomaly, a flash in the pan who would inevitably either become corrupt like others before him or be overthrown by more ruthless opponents. But these criticisms, rather than diminishing the impact of Traoré's story, seemed only to amplify it. Every attack on him sparked defensive responses from his supporters, keeping the conversation alive, keeping his example in the public consciousness. International media, after their initial surprise at the confrontation, began producing longer features about Traoré and Burkina Faso. Documentary filmmakers proposed projects. Academic researchers sought funding to study what they were calling the Burkina Faso model of post-conflict reconciliation. Western governments and international organizations, which had initially condemned Traoré's military takeover, found themselves in an awkward position. They couldn't continue to simply label him a dictator when his actual behavior demonstrated more democratic values than many of the elected leaders they supported elsewhere. Some Western leaders tried to co-opt his narrative, praising his mercy while still maintaining sanctions or other forms of pressure on Burkina Faso. But this selective support rang hollow to most observers, who could see the hypocrisy in praising Traoré's values while continuing to punish his country. Economically, foreign corporations that had enjoyed unrestricted access to Burkina Faso's resources under previous governments found their situation increasingly difficult. They had relied on instability and corruption to maintain favorable terms. But as the country stabilized under Traoré's leadership, as his government insisted on fair contracts and equitable resource sharing, their profit margins shrank. These corporations tried various strategies to undermine Traoré, funding opposition movements, spreading disinformation about his government, lobbying their home governments to maintain or increase sanctions. But after the confrontation with Kaboré, these efforts became more difficult. How do you convince people that a leader is dangerous when he's demonstrating extraordinary restraint and humanity? How do you argue for regime change when the alternative is likely to be worse? How do you justify supporting rebels when the most prominent rebel commander has surrendered and is now warning others about being manipulated by foreign interests? The corporations didn't give up. Too much money was at stake. But their tactics had to become more subtle, more indirect. And even then, they found that the population of Burkina Faso, having seen their leader's character so clearly demonstrated, was less susceptible to manipulation than they had hoped. But this story wouldn't be complete without acknowledging the personal toll on Ibrahim Traoré himself. While millions celebrated him, while his example inspired movements across the continent, while his mercy toward Kaboré was praised as a model of leadership, Traoré himself carried burdens that few understood. He received constant death threats, intelligence services from foreign governments that saw him as a threat to their interests in the region monitored his movements, looking for opportunities. Some of the rebel commanders who hadn't followed Kaboré's example remained committed to killing him. His security team urged him constantly to increase his protection, to limit his public appearances, to stop his habit of traveling to remote areas to meet with ordinary citizens. But Traoré refused to become isolated in a protective bubble. He had become a leader to serve his people, and he couldn't serve them effectively from behind walls and guards. "If they kill me, he would tell his worried advisors. "But I won't stop being who I am because of fear. The moment I do that, they've already won." This stance was admirable, but it also meant living with constant anxiety about his safety. Every public appearance was a calculated risk. Every trip outside the capital was an opportunity for assassination. His close friends and family lived in fear for him, knowing that history was full of African leaders who had challenged the established order and paid for it with their lives. There was also the burden of expectations. Millions of people across Africa looked to Traoré as a symbol of hope, as proof that different leadership was possible. This was inspiring but also overwhelming. How could one person carry the hopes of so many? What happened if he failed, if he made mistakes, if he proved unable to deliver all that people expected? Traoré felt this weight acutely. In private moments with close advisors, he would sometimes express his doubts and fears. "I'm just one person," he would say. "I don't have all the answers. I'm trying to do my best, but what if my best isn't enough?" These moments of vulnerability made him more human, more relatable to those who knew him well. But he was careful not to express these doubts publicly, knowing that too many people depended on his strength, his certainty, his unwavering commitment. There was also the moral complexity of his decisions. Extending mercy to Kaboré had been the right choice, Traoré believed, but it meant that some of Kaboré's victims would never see full justice. How did you balance the principle of mercy with the legitimate demands for accountability? How did you pursue reconciliation without betraying those who had suffered most? These weren't theoretical questions for Traoré. They were agonizing moral dilemmas that kept him awake at night. He met with victims of violence, listened to their pain, their anger, their demands for justice. He understood their feelings completely and felt the weight of his inability to give them everything they deserved. "I can't bring back your loved ones," he would tell them honestly. "I can't undo what was done. All I can do is try to stop it from continuing, to create a future where such things happen less and less. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't heal your pain. But it's all I have to offer." Some accepted this with understanding. Others remained angry, feeling betrayed by what they saw as Traoré's softness toward those who had hurt them. He carried this weight too, knowing that no matter what he did, some people would feel that he had failed them. Despite these challenges, despite the constant threats and the weight of expectations, Traoré continued his work of trying to transform Burkina Faso, and the results, slowly but surely, began to show. Agricultural production increased as his government provided support to farmers, better seeds, irrigation systems, training in modern techniques while respecting traditional knowledge, and most importantly, fair prices for their crops, rather than the exploitative rates they had received under previous systems controlled by foreign agribusiness. Schools were built and renovated. Traoré made education a priority, understanding that lasting change required an educated population. He didn't just focus on urban areas, but made special efforts to reach rural communities that had been neglected for decades. Mobile schools were established to reach nomadic populations. Teacher training programs were expanded and improved. Healthcare access improved. Clinics were opened in rural areas. Medical personnel were recruited and properly compensated. While Burkina Faso remained poor and couldn't afford cutting-edge medical technology, basic health care became more accessible to more people than ever before. Infrastructure development accelerated. Roads were built connecting remote areas to markets. Electrical grids were expanded. Water systems were installed in villages that had never had reliable access to clean water. These weren't glamorous projects, but they transformed daily life for millions of people. Significantly, Traoré ensured that these development projects employed local workers and contractors rather than foreign companies. This meant the money stayed in Burkina Faso's economy, creating jobs and building capacity rather than flowing out of the country as it had under previous development schemes. He also reformed the military, the institution from which he had emerged. Soldiers received better pay, better equipment, and better training. But more importantly, he established clear ethical guidelines and accountability mechanisms. Soldiers who abused civilians or engaged in corruption were punished, not protected by their commanders. This created a military that was more professional, more disciplined, and more respected by the population. Unlike in many African countries where civilians feared soldiers almost as much as they feared rebels or criminals, in Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, the military was increasingly seen as protectors rather than predators. Economic reforms aimed at reducing dependence on foreign aid and exploitation. Traoré's government renegotiated mining contracts to ensure Burkina Faso received a fairer share of its own resources. They developed local processing capacity so that raw materials could be refined within the country, adding value and creating jobs rather than simply exporting everything for others to profit from. These changes didn't happen smoothly or without resistance. Every reform threatened someone's interests. Every step towards sovereignty challenged some external power. But Traoré persisted, using the moral authority he had built through actions like his mercy toward Kaboré to maintain public support even when changes were difficult or uncomfortable. As Burkina Faso stabilized and developed under Traoré's leadership, his influence on the global stage grew. He began receiving invitations to speak at international forums, to address regional organizations, to share his perspective on African development and sovereignty. His speeches were unlike typical political addresses. He didn't rely on abstract rhetoric or diplomatic platitudes. Instead, he spoke plainly and directly about the challenges facing Africa, about the continuing legacy of colonialism, about the contemporary forms of exploitation that kept African nations dependent and poor. At an African Union summit, he delivered a speech that became widely circulated. We talk about development, but what does development mean? If it means becoming more like Europe or America, adopting their systems regardless of whether they fit our contexts, then I suggest we need a different word. True development means strengthening our ability to meet our own needs, to make our own decisions, to chart our own course. He continued, "We are told we need foreign investment, foreign expertise, foreign models. But I ask, why are our own people not good enough? Why must we assume that wisdom comes only from outside? Why do we accept as natural that foreign companies should extract our resources while our own people remain poor?" These speeches made him both celebrated and controversial. African populations, particularly young people, loved his directness and his challenge to the conventional wisdom that had kept their countries subordinate. But established powers, both within and outside Africa, found his rhetoric threatening. Some African leaders, especially those who maintained close ties with former colonial powers, criticized Traoré as radical and unrealistic. They argued that his approach would isolate Burkina Faso, that countries needed foreign investment to develop, that challenging powerful external actors was counterproductive. But Traoré responded calmly to these criticisms. "I'm not against foreign partnership. I'm against foreign domination. I'm not against investment. I'm against exploitation. I'm not against learning from others. I'm against assuming we have nothing to teach. There's a difference, and if we can't see that difference, we'll remain dependent forever." His influence began to manifest in concrete ways across the continent. In several African countries, youth movements emerged explicitly inspired by Traoré's example, demanding greater sovereignty, less corruption, more equitable resource sharing. Political candidates in various elections invoked his name and principles, trying to associate themselves with his popularity. Regional economic discussions began incorporating ideas that Traoré had championed: greater emphasis on intra-African trade rather than export to former colonial powers, development of local industrial capacity, resistance to unfavorable terms in international contracts. Not all of these movements succeeded. Entrenched interests were powerful and well-funded, but the conversation had shifted. Traoré had helped make it acceptable, even admirable, to question the established order, to demand better, to believe that African nations could chart their own course. Years after the confrontation with Mamadou Kaboré, the moment remained a defining symbol of Ibrahim Traoré's leadership. But it had been joined by many other moments, many other decisions, many other demonstrations of his principles in action. When a drought threatened food security, Traoré mobilized the military not for combat, but for humanitarian support, distributing food and water to affected areas. When ethnic tensions threatened to explode in certain regions, he personally traveled there, meeting with community leaders, listening to grievances, working toward reconciliation rather than taking sides or imposing solutions by force. When corruption was discovered within his own government, he didn't cover it up or protect the guilty because they were his appointees. He ordered investigations, allowed them to proceed independently, and enforced consequences regardless of who was implicated. This strengthened rather than weakened his government, proving that accountability applied to everyone. When economic pressures mounted due to international sanctions and reduced foreign aid, instead of compromising his principles or accepting unfavorable terms from foreign lenders, he appealed directly to the Burkina people, explaining the situation honestly and asking for their patience and support as the country worked toward greater self-sufficiency. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with people accepting short-term hardships in exchange for long-term sovereignty. These accumulated actions created a track record that went far beyond one dramatic moment. They established a pattern of leadership characterized by integrity, courage, and genuine commitment to serving the people rather than exploiting them. Historians and political scientists began studying the Burkina Faso model, trying to understand what made Traoré's leadership distinctive and whether it could be replicated elsewhere. Some identified key elements: his personal integrity and simple lifestyle that made corruption accusations untenable, his military background that gave him security credibility while his merciful approach prevented military rule from becoming brutal, his youth that connected him with a generation tired of the same old politics, his articulation of African sovereignty in terms that resonated with contemporary concerns rather than outdated ideologies. But other analysts argued that Traoré's success couldn't be reduced to a formula, that it depended fundamentally on his personal character, his specific context, his particular gifts. They warned against trying to replicate his approach mechanically, suggesting instead that other leaders should learn from his principles while finding their own authentic expression of them. What everyone agreed on was that Ibrahim Traoré had demonstrated something important: that African leadership could offer the world a different model, one rooted not in Western concepts of power or Eastern philosophies of authority, but in African values of Ubuntu, of community, of shared humanity. The confrontation with Traoré perfectly embodied this. It showed that strength could be expressed through mercy rather than violence, that enemies could be transformed rather than destroyed, that the goal wasn't to dominate but to elevate, not just to win, but to create conditions where everyone could win. As this account is being written, Ibrahim Traoré remains in power in Burkina Faso. His story is still unfolding. He faces enormous challenges: ongoing security threats, economic pressures, the constant tension between his ideals and the messy realities of governing. He has made mistakes. Some policies haven't worked as intended. Some appointments have proven poor choices. Some promises have been harder to fulfill than anticipated. He would be the first to acknowledge these shortcomings, just as he has always been honest about the difficulties facing his country. But through it all, he has maintained his fundamental integrity, his commitment to his principles, his determination to serve his people rather than exploit them. And this consistency has maintained the trust and support of millions who believe in him and what he represents. The confrontation with Mamadou Traoré remains the most famous moment of his leadership because it captured in one dramatic scene everything he stands for: the courage to face enemies without fear, the wisdom to see them as human beings rather than just obstacles, the strength to offer mercy when revenge would be easier, the vision to break cycles of violence rather than perpetuate them. But that moment gains its power from being part of a larger pattern, a consistent demonstration of values across countless decisions and actions. If it had been an isolated incident of mercy in an otherwise brutal regime, it would ring hollow. Instead, it's one bright illustration of principles that Traoré lives by daily. Young people across Africa continue to watch him, to learn from him, to be inspired by his example. They wear shirts with his image, share his speeches on social media, invoke his name when demanding better from their own leaders. For many, he represents hope, not naive optimism that everything will be easy, but grounded hope that change is possible if people have courage and integrity. Mamadou Traoré, meanwhile, continues his quiet work in his village, talking with young men who might otherwise be recruited into militias, warning them about the emptiness of that path, encouraging them toward honest labor and genuine service. He will never be celebrated as a hero. His past is too dark for that. but he has become a living testament to the possibility of redemption, proof that it's never too late to change course. The relationship between Traoré and Traoré after that famous handshake has remained complex. They haven't become friends or close associates. There's too much history, too much pain for that. But there's a mutual respect, an understanding that they each played a role in a moment that transcended both of them. On the anniversary of their confrontation, Traoré issued a statement thanking Traoré again for offering him a path back to humanity. Traoré responded simply, "We all need mercy sometimes. We all need someone to see us not as we are, but as we could be. I hope we can build a Burkina Faso where everyone receives such opportunities. When historians eventually write the full story of Ibrahim Traoré and the transformation of Burkina Faso, a story that is still being written as these words are recorded, they will chronicle many achievements. Economic reforms that reduced poverty, security improvements that brought peace to troubled regions, infrastructure development that connected communities, educational expansion that empowered new generations. But they will also write extensively about the confrontation with the rebel commander Mamadou Traoré, because it encapsulates something essential about Traoré's leadership and about the possibilities he opened. They will write about how a young captain, facing humiliation and death threats from a well-armed enemy backed by powerful foreign interests, chose mercy over vengeance, transformation over domination, hope over hate. They will write about how that single act of forgiveness rippled outward, changing hearts, changing minds, influencing conflicts far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. They will write about how Ibrahim Traoré proved that African leadership could offer the world a different model, one that didn't require becoming the monster you sought to overthrow, one that held on to humanity even in circumstances that seemed to demand brutality. They will write about the thousands of people who were inspired to choose differently, to act with courage and integrity, to believe that cycles of violence could be broken, all because they witnessed one man extending his hand to an enemy and saying, "I forgive you." Most importantly, they will write about how in that moment of confrontation, surrounded by weapons and cameras and the weight of national and continental expectations, Ibrahim Traoré showed us all who we could be if we chose courage over fear, compassion over cruelty, hope over despair. This is why the story of Ibrahim Traoré will be told and retold for generations. Not because it's a fairy tale with a perfect ending, but because it's a real story about real choices that real people made, demonstrating that even in our complicated, difficult world, integrity matters, mercy has power, and leadership can be about service rather than domination. The confrontation that changed a nation reminds us that the most powerful weapon isn't always the gun or the bomb or the economic sanction. Sometimes it's the simple act of seeing another person's humanity and choosing to respond with your own.